G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic Wednesday and a fantastic midweek. This video will be out much earlier than usual as I have one coming out tonight that I want to release at a more opportune time for YouTube. But what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to have a quick look at the maps. We need to talk about what some advisors to Donald Trump has said. We need to look at the ICC and arrest warrants put out. And of course, we need to look at this cluster munition that has exploded then over Crimea. So let's get stuck into it. Now, just to give you a layout of everything we'll talk about, of course, here's Ukraine, the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. This, of course, being Crimea down here. And this is what we're going to speak about first, was at this location here where we then see cluster munitions exploding in the water and on the ground. Now, it's funny to see that all the pro-Russian accounts are now acting as if their air defense never works, and all the pro-Ukrainian accounts now acting as if Russian air defense then always intercepts, because we see how people will shift and apply logic to fit within bias. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what I see, bits and pieces that I think fit in logic, and we'll talk about what this is. But you're more than welcome to disagree with me. This is the whole point of being on the internet. Like, this is the point of Telegram and people being allowed to speak about it, and in comments below here. Now, a couple of things. I can't show you absolutely everything in this, but this are the clusters out here. Now, you can see there's a very wide dispersion here compared to other clusters of which we have seen before from then the same systems, much closer in. So, and I will say in this too, it does seem like a lot less of these munitions than some of those then carry. This isn't beyond reasonable doubt. It's just what the footage we're seeing shows us. What would most likely be then the targets in here? Well, this is then the Bilbek airfield up here. This is about, it won't matter exactly to the meter, about 5 kilometers to the north. And then we know there's all shipyards down here, approximately, say, 2.5, 1.6 miles then to the southeast of this location at the beach here. Most likely, these would be the targets these are going for. And what we have seen is that Russia said that 4 of 5 were intercepted and the 5th then exploded and the clusters came out. But that doesn't give us exactly what has happened here. Now, something that I apply to everything, and people get pissed at me about this, and I'm welcome to hate, is an ATACMS, ballistic missiles like this. These are incredibly expensive assets. And we need to apply sort of Occam's razor of, well, okay, we've seen an expensive asset, the informational fallout of hitting a civilian target, the juice is not going to be worth the squeeze of this. Why would that then be the target? And this is something that I have applied to many strikes before. Now, regardless of what you think of Russia, it makes no sense either for a multi-million-dollar cruise missile to go into then a residential building. We apply it one way, we apply it then the other. That's at least how I see the war. You can disagree with this, but as far as these expensive weapons that they do have a finite supply of, both Ukraine and Russia, I apply that there. Now, munitions can have malfunction, of course, and there can be a level of inaccuracy where we have seen civilian objects, of course, hit before. And I do believe that there is absolutely a disregard for trying to protect civilians, both from shelling, missiles, drones, all of this, as well as to protect civilians around military areas or legitimate targets as well. But what we see in this footage, there is no doubt that these are civilians. And we, of course, see the completely sadistic comments about people on this beach. These people are civilians. And I think many forget that many people living in Crimea have been there since well before 2014, and that these are Ukrainian people then living here. Now, the usual question I see getting asked is why be out in then an active war zone? And yes, some of these people most likely maybe are holidaying here. But there's also probably a lot of people that are living here and have gone to the beach. And just like the logic we apply before, which I apply equally, then you can suggest people out in a war zone will apply it into another location of which may not fit your bias, and instantly you'll come up with then reasons for this. So my problems with this is the complete disregard for civilian casualties, regardless, I guess, in this case of who is primarily then responsible. My primary concern from this is the lack of outrage when civilians are then killed or injured from either side, and there is no responsibility taken regardless of this. You know, it should have been from EU officials, from officials around the globe saying civilian casualties should be limited then regardless. So I think most likely in this case that this was either hit by EW. We know Russia's having a lot of success with GPS jamming, or it may have been intercepted in the air. But I can't say this beyond reasonable doubt. I'm not an expert to look at these weapon systems, and the bloggers on TikTok or YouTube or whatever, then they, I'm guessing, are not experts on this exact weapon system either. But we have seen throughout this war a disregard for civilian casualties, regardless of who is responsible. And this has been one of my primary concerns and something that I try and raise all the time. And say with this strike here, for example, we have seen Ukrainian officials paint these people here as civilian occupiers, which does concern me for if and when we were to see a Ukrainian ground operation into then this area, and how that would look if the civilians here are painted as civilian occupiers. And this is the exact way we have seen the treatment of civilians in other areas come under Russian occupation here too, and of course the horrific outcomes we have seen in this. I apply things both ways. Now, I know most people have clicked off this and have disliked the video because I try and be as reasonable and apply logic to either way here, not just trying to fit then a bias. Now, the ICC, the International Criminal Courts, has then issued arrest warrants for then Shoigu and Gerasimov. But I think any hope of a lot of these warrants, either against Putin, Gerasimov, Shoigu, then these went under the water as soon as the ICC issued warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. That then the US and other nations quickly pointed out that the ICC has no jurisdiction or authority. So I think realistically the possibility of any one of these major powers and their officials being arrested was lost at that specific point. If the US won't back the arrest warrant, why then would Russia or China? Especially as these countries have either not ratified and or signed. Again, we're adding then that logic across both ways. So I think any credibility of that system was lost then at that point. But let's have a look at this. Situation in Ukraine. ICC judges issue arrest warrants against Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov. That in Ukraine for alleged international crimes committed from at least the 10th of October 22 to at least the 9th of March 2023. That Shoigu, born 1955, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation at the time, alleged conduct of Mr. Valery Gerasimov, born also 1955, Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation and First Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. That for the war crime of causing excessive incidental harm to civilians or damage to civilian objects of the Rome Statute, and the crime against humanity of inhumane acts under then these articles. It considered that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the two suspects bear responsibility for missile strikes carried out by the Russian Federation against Ukrainian electric infrastructure from these dates. During this time, a large number of strikes against numerous electric power plants and substations were carried out by the Russian armed forces in multiple locations in Ukraine. Now, what you'll be thinking here is talking about dual-use items and the targeting of things like electrical power plants. But there are reasonable grounds to believe the alleged strikes directed against civilian objects and for those installations may have qualified as military objectives at relevant time. So were they relevant at that time as a military objective? The expected incidental civilian harm and damage would have been clearly excessive to the anticipated military advantage. So this is where that dual use comes in. What is the civilian damage of targeting this versus the military advantage? Now, I'm not one to judge that. I don't know the complete situation of this, but they have obviously seen in this that the military advantage was significantly less than the civilian harm. This is what they point out in the warrants as well against then the Israeli officials. Therefore, there are reasonable grounds to believe that suspects internationally caused great suffering or serious injury to body or mental or physical health. Now, I actually spoke about this the other day and people didn't like this, about then the Kerch Strait Bridge, of course, that connects Russia to then Crimea. That we have Ukrainian officials saying there's no military hardware going across this. And I reached out to my international lawyer friend and said, well, if that isn't there, we know this still has civilian trains and civilians go back and forth and food and water and all of this. Is this still a legitimate military target at this point? Of course it is if there's military stuff, but Ukraine said itself that there's then not. Is it a target? He basically came out and said along these lines as well, that it could have been, it may be in the future, but if nothing's rolling across it, maybe at this time, potentially that it's not either. And I thought that was interesting to talk about as well. And with that power grid, looking that it's had more effect than the military objective. But, and I'll say it again, why would then Russia or China then see to these if the US and other nations, and some nations here who have then ratified, not only signed, are not going to uphold this in another area where they are allies? Why would these countries then uphold it as well? And what will be interesting is to see if then these Israeli officials with the warrants out travel to one of these countries then in the greeny blue, whatever this color is, and then if they are or not arrested, because these countries should have then authority or should have the responsibility to arrest those officials. Same as if Putin goes, say, to Hungary, he should be arrested. Would he? I think it was Hungary or maybe Slovakia said then they wouldn't. So that is something interesting to look at. And I think that whole system, and something we're seeing from this war, is systems undermined and how much power then they actually do and or don't have. Now, something which we are seeing a lot of is bloggers outside of the US criticizing very heavily political candidates. And there will be a lot of attempts to undermine both candidates leading into the election from not only individuals, institutions, and states. And it may be difficult to see what's behind then the messaging coming forward. It may be coming from X individual, but you have no idea what then is behind this, or X institution, or regardless. And a lot of this is fueling up again today because of some comments from advisors to former President Donald Trump. Now, this is from Reuters. 2 key advisors to Trump have presented him with a plan to end Russia's war in Ukraine if he wins the election. That involves telling Ukraine it will only get more US weapons if it enters peace talks. So drying up that if you don't enter peace talks, more through if you do. The US would at the same time warn Moscow that any refusals to negotiate would result in increased US support for Ukraine. That there would be a ceasefire based on the prevailing battle lines during peace talks. And when they presented their strategy to Trump, the Republican presidential candidate responded favorably, adding, "I'm not claiming he agreed with it or agreed with every word of it, but we were pleased to get the feedback we did." So it would pause along the battle lines in a ceasefire. There would be sort of an ultimatum given to both Ukraine and Russia that if you keep going, we'll supply more weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine, if you keep going, we will then draw down on those weapons as well. Now, the Kremlin has said the peace plan proposed by a possible future Trump administration would have to reflect the reality on the ground. Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, saying the value of any plan lies in the nuances in taking into account the real state of affairs on the ground. President Putin has repeatedly said that Russia has been and remains open to negotiations, taking into account the real state of affairs on the ground. And this is something then we saw the other day with Putin proposing the peace plan of that he takes the rest of Kherson, Zapdonetsk, Luhansk oblasts for then a peace. What he's saying here, what Peskov is saying, is it needs to reflect what's happening on the ground. Now, if Trump was to get in, what Russia would be pushing on is, well, if they, as we see at the moment, still advancing, they will go, we could still advance, so we want a little bit more or less regardless. It'll be interesting to see. And I looked up then the betting, and it looks, from this, and this is where I go, because the news and YouTubers and bloggers, their money's not where their mouth is, where these betting websites, they are. So it's putting Trump in the lead by a little bit to Joe Biden. And I think Biden has shot himself in the foot. I think he got back some votes yesterday with the release of Julian Assange, but I think his own voter base are so against what is happening in Israel. And if Israel then go into the north, into Lebanon, that will even get worse. I think a lot of those people will be like, I can't vote. It doesn't mean then they'll vote for Trump, but they may put their vote then elsewhere. That's just my prediction from an outsider looking in. And I will say American politics, I don't have much idea. But let's then have a look at the maps. But one thing I will say on American politics is when the elections are on, I will be going to the US just to see what goes down. Now, of course, we explained these areas on the map. There is very, very little changes happening, more so some grey zone shifts, but it may tell us some stuff. So we come up in the Kupiansk front here. Now, we do have a map update from Noel Reports then in this area. We'll zoom in just a little bit more. This reservoir here, just up from this town. So we can see that he is saying that Russians have advanced basically right up to where this sort of tree line, end of reservoir creek line comes through here. And this is slightly seen by then a grey zone shift then on this map. So we know there has been a shift in something there. There's no Syriac map updates for today. If there are, I'll add them in here. And then we come down to Krasnodarivka, where we did see a change on some maps yesterday, but then we do see just a grey zone shift out to the northwest here too, of Russia controlling more up now in these western blocks. But this comes yesterday. We saw then a red shift here as well as Russia creep its way through Krasnodarivka. So interesting in seeing what is happening here. Slower day on the maps here. It doesn't mean it's been a slower day on the front line. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been shifts. It just may take days to reflect this. So let me know of what you think, whether we talked about today, what I'm right, what I'm wrong on, and any feedback on that other than calling me a knob. Anyway, that's fine too. Look after yourselves. I'll speak tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.